Speaking Human.
Today on Speaking Human, we name our thoughts on the much buzzed about title of the new Star Wars movie and identify what makes the Force strong with a company name. Think names don't matter? Tell that to Quickster, Anal Tech, and Jar Jar Binks.
Speaking Human.
Welcome to Speaking Human, where we simplify the world of marketing for humans. I'm Shad Conley, and with me is my fellow Jedi, Patrick Jebber. How's it going, man?
It's going pretty good. I feel like it's been a long time since we've recorded, but it's really only been a couple weeks.
It feels like years.
Doesn't it feel like the Super Bowl was like 7 years ago?
It's amazing how quickly it just kind of fades into the past. You know, such a big event, you talk about it for a month, and then it's almost like it never happened, or it was just goes into the history book.
Nobody's even talking about it anymore.
Well, except for us, for 1 minute here, because we got a little bit of housekeeping here, you know, on our Super Bowl episode where we shared our picks for our favorite or what we thought were the best and worst Super Bowl ads of all time. We let the listeners vote, and vote they did, Patrick. And the results, not great for me. Pretty good for you, though. The hardest thing for me is just realizing that our listeners, you know, have such bad taste. They think this Apple commercial was so good when we all know it's overrated. Anyway, the results of the Super Bowl voting. So for best commercial of all time, you had Apple's 1984 Sledgehammer. I had Budweiser's 1989 Bud Bowl. Voting, 71.4% of people agreed with you. Pretty dominant victory. 71.4 versus 28.6% for Bud Bowl. Pretty weak. Thanks a lot for supporting me, everyone. And then for our picks for worst commercial of all time, it was much closer. For a while there, it was neck and neck, 50-50 in the voting. But in the end, you won out on that one, too. You had Nationwide's 2015 Dead Child commercial. I had GoDaddy's 2013 Perfect Match commercial. And the results of that voting was you took that one 57.1% to my 42.9%. So that one was a little closer. And like I said, it was neck and neck for much of the voting. But in the end, you won them both, man. I just can't believe it. I got crushed like a grape.
Isn't that strange, though? Because most of the time, I think your lists are just generally much better than my list. So I was pretty shocked that I was ahead. For a while there, like you said, we were neck and neck. And I thought, well, you're going to probably take it. You have your finger on the pulse of the world with your lists.
Clearly, I know nothing and I'm not in touch with the world's population like I thought I was. I understand Nationwide, but man, Apple, I still think it's overrated, and I think 71.4% of people are completely wrong.
The Apple one, again, going back, it's shorter and sweeter. You know, the Bud Bowl was such a long span of commercials, you know, in between that whole Super Bowl, that I think that probably hurt it in the long run. You know what I mean?
Yeah, maybe. And the Apple one just has that reputation as being that groundbreaking Super Bowl ad. I think that in general just kind of, and your arguments, of course, propelled it to victory.
Yeah, well, that's the main thing, you know.
So moving on from the Super Bowl to the topic of this week's show. And this week we're talking names and titles. I'm going to start you out with a movie-related question, Patrick. Thinking of all the movies that came out last year, 2016, what movie do you think had the best title and why? Go.
There were a lot of ones that stood out to me for different reasons, but I ended up landing on The Secret Life of Pets. And here's why. I felt like it appealed to a broad audience, people with pets, people who love their pets, people with kids who love their pets. What do pets do when we're not home? I think that's just one of those age-old questions, you know? That's why people get drop cams and now to watch their pets because, you know, in your imagination, your pets are doing all these crazy things when you're not there. And I think the name of that movie sort of played off of what is this secret life my pet has, you know, when I'm not around. So that's why I chose it.
That's a good choice. That's actually a really good one. I hadn't thought too much about, but yeah, it's one of those titles that creates kind of, here's the promise of what we're going to show you. Mm-hmm. We're going to show you what your pets are doing when you're not around. which, I saw that movie and it doesn't really live up to that. That's like such a small part of the movie. It was kind of disappointing in that way.
Yeah, yeah.
So an example of maybe a movie not quite living up to its title, which is interesting too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about you? What did you think had the best title from 2016?
I went with La La Land. Not a movie I have seen, but the reason I think this is a good title is it's a familiar phrase that is kind of given a clever spin here. It tells you two key things about the movie. One is it's a musical, La La, music. And the other thing is it's a story about Hollywood. So it's all kind of contained there in that title. It's one of these things that kind of has a couple layers to it. They give you this familiar sounding, everyone's heard that term for Hollywood, La La Land. And here you have kind of these two layers placed on top of it. I think it's clever and it works, and it's also just a catchy title.
Yeah, I like that title too. That one stuck out, and I did see that movie. But it's catchy. It's just these are a couple of people who are sort of living in that world. They're living in La La Land. So that's a good choice.
Did you like the movie? Would you recommend it?
I did like that movie actually for a musical, which I'm not a huge musical fan. I don't know. It was very satisfying watching it.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. The one other title I'll mention that I kind of had in my mind that's kind of my runner-up, I guess, was Midnight Special, which was kind of this small sci-fi movie. I thought it was a good title because it just kind of alludes to something dark and mysterious and kind of what's happening in this movie where you're kind of watching this sci-fi mystery unravel in front of you. I thought it was a good fit, and it's a very intriguing title.
I'm actually interested in seeing that movie.
Yeah, I watched it. That's pretty good. I would recommend checking that one out. The ending, not great on that one, but the movie that comes before it I thought was really good.
Good recommendations from the Speaking Human
I
crew
know,
today.
you could get information about titles and movie recommendations. What a podcast.
It's unlike any other.
So moving away from, our Siskel and Ebert here, what do you think about movie titles? We're using this as kind of an example to get into company names. Thinking of movie titles, does that make an impact on whether you see a movie or not? Like what the title is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, movie producers, it's a proven fact. What you name something, it's going to affect how people perceive it and then if they buy it, right? And in this case, it's movies. I want to give a good example. Look at the big titles just from last year, one of which was Batman versus Superman. We all know that that's just a ploy to get you into the theater to watch, good guys fight each other. They played off that old fantasy argument that plays out all the time. If Superman fought Batman, who would win,
Oh, who would win?
Yeah. It did have an aspect of Batman versus Superman, but it didn't really play out that way.
Yeah, not totally delivering that. And I think, you don't necessarily think about it. You're not consciously like, oh, I'm going to go see this because I like the title. It's something that happens subconsciously. You're like, you hear this title and you're like, this movie's for me or it's not for me.
Mm-hmm.
To give you an example, I was listening to a podcast recently where they were talking about the movie 20th Century Women. And they're like, this is a really good movie, but probably not a lot of people are going to see it because the title implies that it's a movie for women. Whether it is or not, just based on that title alone, you're pushing some people away, which is something that can happen.
It's all about piquing people's interest, right? I mean, that's what they're trying to do in all of these movie titles. Some are better at it than others, just like in product brand names or just like in company brand names, So you'll have your really good ones and you'll have your ones where you're like, yeah, they could have probably got a bigger audience had they named it something that would have appealed to a broader spectrum.
Yeah, definitely. A lot's packed into these little titles, and I think we'll talk about that more as we talk about the specific title we're going to talk about today.
Yes. And in a minute, we'll dive into the most talked about movie title of 2017. But first, let's get a quick word from our sponsor.
Today's episode of Speaking Human is sponsored by the abominable snow monster from Empire Strikes Back. That's right, humans. That crazy Wampa ice creature who kidnapped Luke Skywalker on the planet Hoth is sponsoring the Speaking Human podcast today. He says, which translates loosely to, when you need Wampa-sized product branding, consider the creative team at Monsters Unlimited. Visit thinkmonsters.com for more information.
That familiar jingle comes from a little movie series known as Star Wars. It's called the Imperial March, but you may know it as Darth Vader's theme. Speaking of titles, Patrick, why don't you tell the people the officially revealed title of Star Wars Episode 8?
Well, I feel like when I say this, people are going to be like, yeah, obviously, we read that 6 weeks ago. But
You mean this isn't breaking news
it's
here?
not really breaking news. But as everyone may or may not know, it's called The Last Jedi.
Dun dun dun.
Yeah. Moment of silence. Contemplate.
Take it in.
Reflect.
Take it in. I think next time, they need to, Lucasfilm or Disney, they need to call us up and let us announce it on this podcast, which is, the place you want to let people know your new Star Wars movie title.
Well, yeah, obviously. I mean, Speaking Human is the place for that.
The place for that. So what do you think of this title? Now that it's sunk in, The Last Jedi. Is this a good title?
I think it's okay. I look at the movie franchise. I sat all the names in front of me. The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, The Force Awakens, and now The Last Jedi. And I think it fits within that theme, that whole movie franchise naming system, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing the big picture, I think, is very crucial to the naming of the movie. I'd say I like it well enough. How about you?
I had kind of the same response, especially when you list them off there. You can see it just fits in there fine. But it's so funny, with Star Wars, all these little tidbits you get are chewed on by fans, so they become such a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Then you hear the title, The Last Jedi, and you're like, it's fine.
Yeah.
It has that straightforward, serialized, comic booky type name. It fits the mold. The thing that's probably the best about it, at least pre-release, is it gives fans something to think about, which is, who is the Last Jedi?
Yeah.
One thing I will say is it's odd to me as a middle of the trilogy film title. It seems like it should be, obviously the last, like the third film would be The Last Jedi. So to have the middle film as The Last Jedi seems a little odd.
It is a little weird, but the next movie is going to be called The Very Last Jedi. So
No, this is really The Last Jedi.
we were just kidding. Just kidding. This is The Last Jedi.
Oh, and then episode 11. Oh, there's a couple more Jedi.
Wait, did we say those were that wasn't The Last Jedi?
By last, we mean there's a ton of them. So looking at all the existing Star Wars titles, which one do you think is the best? And which one do you think is the worst?
So the worst, I would say, The Phantom Menace. It was just very blah. The best I put as Empire Strikes Back. I think it had some very actionable words in that title that made you excited against all odds. The underdogs would come back from that. You know what I mean? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. That one's interesting, The Emperor Strikes Back. To me, that always rung as an odd title.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, it doesn't so much anymore because it's just so ingrained, like I was saying, and because the first film, there was a while where the first film was just called Star Wars. And then, kind of got A New Hope tag, which everybody calls it by now.
Right.
I'm with you. The worst is The Phantom Menace by a mile. I mean, it sounds like the name of like a 1920s radio show.
Mm-hmm.
The Phantom Menace strikes again.
Yeah.
It's just so vague. And I remember at the time people were so excited for the prequels. And then you heard that title and that was the first sign like, maybe this isn't going to be great.
Yeah.
Before that, it was like, there's no possibility these movies aren't going to be good. And then you kind of heard that, and maybe this is just me looking back, but it's like the first sign, The Phantom Menace, something's not quite good here.
Well, it was a prelude to what was actually going to happen, I think.
Yeah. I'll say this first. Star Wars by itself is probably one of the best titles of all time for anything.
Oh, yeah.
It immediately, it's sci-fi. It promises spectacle and action and conflict. It's all there in these two words that just roll with each other so well. Star Wars. Coming up with that title alone, that's a great, great title.
Yeah.
But the one, I'd probably say I like the best is Return of the Jedi. Originally Revenge of the Jedi. It's simple. It's kind of like The Last Jedi in that sense, but it's after Empire just kind of signaled, we're coming back here. Something good's on the rise. Something's going to happen. I thought it was always a good title that just kind of had a good ring to it.
Return of the Jedi definitely has that same effect. Like The Last Jedi, who is that Last Jedi,
Yeah, yeah. And moving over from movie titles to company names, which, as I said, are kind of related, kind of not. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think they're similar in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I think movie names are an ideal example of branding, whether it's product or company branding. In some ways, it's a truer form of it because you get to see in a very condensed format how that branding plays out, right?
Yeah, you're trying to encapsulate. You have this bigger thing and you're trying to encapsulate it in this word or couple words. The thing with both movie titles and company names that I found just even looking through these is that a bad title or company name can really hurt you,
Oh, yeah.
if that makes sense. If you know what I'm saying. The positive you get from them is kind of minimal, but the negative you can get from them can be a lot.
Yeah, just like anything in life, when you're doing something really well, you don't see a lot of reaction. But as soon as you misstep, someone's going to shed light on it. Somehow it's going to impact you.
Yeah, a bad name will turn you off more than a good name will turn you on. It's a good way to put it,
Right.
One of the major differences between like picking a company or a brand name as opposed to like a movie title is you have more room to be a little more abstract with the company name. From looking through these names and even examining the history of them, like how names look, how they sound, how they kind of roll off the tongue are more important things with company names than you would see with a title of something.
Like you were talking about earlier, though, sometimes when you're very obvious with the movie naming, it can be to the detriment of the movie. I think when they're a little bit more creative with their movie titles, it has a tendency to help them, like the 20th Century Women. I'll give a great example of a fantastic movie that did really well last year, Hidden Figures. You know what the movie's about, like you hear people talking about it, and it's like, oh, that sounds like a good movie. And, the trailers aren't leaving anything to the imagination, but the movie title gives you this sense of mystery that otherwise could have probably hurt them if they had chosen any other name.
And that's a good one too. That's one of the things I like about, and I'll probably discuss this more, is both about movie titles and company names is when they work on two levels like that. Like Hidden Figures in many ways has like two meanings, It can be these people who were overlooked in their contribution, or just this science approach where these are hidden figures, we're looking at data or something like that, and they both kind of relate to this story and connect in some way. When you see the movie, you probably look at the title differently than when you just hear it, right?
Right.
So that's a cool thing. I like when titles or even company names will work on that level. Like once you find out what the company does, you're like, oh, okay. Now I see this other connection, or I'm kind of peeling back another layer here.
Anytime something works on multiple levels, that makes a huge difference.
So you, Patrick, have personal experience naming a company. You have your own company, Monsters Unlimited, at one point known as Two Monsters in the beginning. What can you tell me about your, personal experience? How did you name your company? What was that? What was kind of your approach, or how'd you come up with that?
Well, it's the idea behind Monsters Unlimited was to create something that was approachable, that broke the ice, and that created curiosity. And since we're a creative agency, it allowed us to have fun with the name in a way that not all brands can, necessarily have fun with. It also speaks to a certain clientele. Having fun with the name of our agency also allowed us to attract the type of clientele that we want to. People who are a little bit more risk takers, who like to have fun with their marketing, who like to have fun with their marketing messages.
Oh, that's a good point. Creating an instant connection, maybe we're for you if you like this, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the same goes for Speaking Human. Speaking Human, through the evolution of our marketing messages, presented itself as a sort of irony, right? Since our company name was Monsters, but we're here helping our clients speak in a more human way with their customers and potential customers. It's a fun play on the idea and theme but also works completely on its own. All brands should speak human with their customers.
Yeah, that's one of those interesting things. That was kind of a message we were floating around and playing with before the podcast.
Right.
So when it came to picking a name for the podcast, we were like, oh, well, this name would apply to what we're trying to do here, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's an evolution.
It's also interesting, speaking humans, one of those things, the more we've done this and the more it's kind of changed, it's kind of the meaning of it and the weight of the name and the way we think about it has kind of changed, or the way we present it, which is what happens with both company names and movie titles. As you go, you can give that more depth, or it can change, or can evolve a little bit, at least with company names.
Yeah.
So when choosing a company name, what are some things, you need to keep in mind? Beyond just like, hey, let's pick a word. What are some things that should be in your mind if you're a company kind of sitting down and like trying to figure out what a good name for your company would be?
There's a bunch, but some of the staples, it has to be memorable, should resonate with your target audience, create a connection with them. And then it should have some sort of meaning, and sometimes it's related to the products you sell, and sometimes it's related to your own personal story. So, or the company's story. So it should do that, should stand out from your competition and the clutter. And then when you come up with a name, realize that a brand can evolve, like we were talking about a little bit earlier. Design it in a way that it can easily adapt over time, I think is really important.
Those are all really good things. All things I would have said pretty similar. Some smaller things you might not think about, but you should keep in mind is one, if you're choosing a company name, the URL. Is it available? Is there something you can use with it? Can you get this company name in some form that makes sense? It's something that you need to keep in mind when you're picking your name. Another thing is, are there other company names out there that people are the same or that people might confuse it with? You want something unique that's your own. You don't want to be one of 10 companies that has the same sounding name. And a third thing is the way it'll look in different places, on buildings, on the web, and on print. How will it look? Appearance-wise, will it work for you or will it work against you? The final thing I'd throw out there is there's a lot of businesses, particularly small businesses, that use pun names. For example, Lawn and Order, Spruce Spring Clean, Walk This Way. I would avoid these names personally. They may work on a local level, but if you want to develop your brand into something bigger in any way, or broader, they're going to work against you. So I would steer clear of puns personally.
Good recommendation. I would probably agree with that. While they're funny and witty and sometimes somewhat cheeky, for longevity's sake, probably not the best idea to go that route.
And also, another thing is sometimes companies will pick a name and not think about what that immediately conjures to mind. Awkward situations where it could be something sexual or something that people make out of your name that you didn't necessarily think about. Last thing, though, I'll ask you, I'm not personally a big fan of people using their, last names or names as just the company name. What do you think about that?
From a naming perspective, this is the thing I would tell people if they consider that. Do you want this company to be something that you pass down or that you want to sell? Because it's much harder to sell to outsiders when it's attached to your own personal brand. While your name may have equity in it because of who you are or whatever, it can also be negative if you ever wanted to sell your company at some point.
It's obviously worked. I just think it's kind of boring. And somebody asks you, hey, how'd you name your company? And you're like, oh, it's my last name. For the most part, it's just not a bad thing. There's been many, many successful companies throughout history who have done this. In the past, this was kind of the thing to do.
Yeah.
If you want it to work,
yeah,
it's not a terrible thing to do, but
it's boring. So, inspired by The Last Jedi and all this title talk, we decided to share some of our favorite company names. Let's get to our picks now.
We looked through some company names. We thought about some of the ones we like the best, and we're just going to tell you what they are and why. Do you want to share anything else about your process for doing this, Patrick?
I picked brands that I thought were good brands and brands that I thought the names were interesting.
I kind of did the same thing, just kind of names that are interesting. looking through company names, and there's a lot of them, like looking into the history of some names that they're just like, it's just something we came up with. I don't really know why.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of that,
Yeah.
which surprised me, I guess.
It's fascinating how many brand names, big, well-known brand names, didn't have a lot of thought put into them necessarily.
Yeah. Which shows you that can work too.
Yeah.
If you wanted to, that can work. I like a little more depth personally. I think you probably do too, Patrick. All right, you want to give me your first one here?
So my first pick is Nike. So to give you a little history of the name, Nike comes from the Greek goddess of victory, and it's pronounced Nike, not Nike, although I think I called it Nike when I was a kid. Did you call it Nike?
I think I always called it Nike, but I'm not sure. I've heard so many people call it Nike.
Yeah. Anyway, the name itself and knowing what they do, sports, apparel, equipment, whatever, the goddess of victory, how that relates to sports. It's a great name that relates to what they do. It rolls off the tongue. The brand itself visually is simple and effective. One of the most well-known brands in the world. So,
yeah, that's probably my favorite company name, honestly, if I'm picking, just because of the origin and how it's just short, strong, and has that look and feel of speed and action. Just a great representation of the company. It's just immediately came to mind as one of the best, which is a good lead into my first pick, which is IKEA. And this has an interesting origin, IKEA. I never knew what it stood for. I just knew it was kind of like this simple, catchy name for this Swedish furniture company or home goods or whatever you would say they produce. But it's actually an acronym produced by the initials of the founder, Ingvar Kamprad, that's my awful Swedish pronunciation there. Forgive me for that. So that's where you get your IK, and then you get your EA from the farm where he grew up, which is Elmtarid or something like that, and which was located in the town of Agunnaryd. I should have looked this up. I knew I was going to have to say it out loud, right? But anyway, that's how you get your IKEA, which, has something to do with the founder and his origins. But it also has this sound that's similar to idea, finding ideas for your home and stuff like that. So I thought it worked well in that way. Short, strong, memorable, definitely unique. There's nothing else. It's so much better than just if it was called like Camp Rads, just the last name type thing. IKEA really stands out and sticks in the mind.
Yeah, that's something too to consider. Is it easy? Does it roll off the tongue? Visually, is it pretty simple for people to grasp how to say it?
You want to make it a name people can pronounce. You don't want them to be like, get their tongue totally tied. But as long as they can get something approximated to it out, you're in good shape.
Yeah. So my next pick, I picked Apple, which we all know what Apple does. Basically, Steve Jobs, they were driving back this place where they were visiting. He called it the Apple Orchard, and he mentioned, what if we named it Apple Computer? And I guess they had other names that they were considering. They even talked about the potential of there being a problem with Apple Records at the time, which is the Beatles-owned record label, and was sued by Apple Records over trademark violations in '89. But, it's just one of those things where they came out, they were still able to use the name, but a huge departure from the actual product that they sold. It stood out from the Microsofts and the IBMs and the very technical names.
The computer big at the time was IBM, which sounds so technical and cold, and then you come out with something as simple and straightforward as Apple, something unintimidating, different. It kind of creates that contrast even more and shows what type of company that was. And I think Jobs has definitely wanted a name like that.
Again, one of the things that you're looking for is to stand out in the clutter, right?
Especially amongst your industry. My next pick is Oracle. Now, Oracle is a word that definition is a medium who gives advice or kind of a prophecy, shows you, looks into the future for you, which obviously fits perfectly with someone who sells computing platforms or engineered systems. I like how the name implies wisdom and knowledge and trust and looking into the future. You get all that kind of from this just one simple word attached to this company. And so this one also has an interesting history. The founders of Oracle, Larry Ellison and Bob Oates, were working on a consulting project for the CIA, and the code name for that project was Oracle. So that's kind of where they got the name for that. It's just a strong name to me that, especially for what they do, I think fits perfectly, and another one that stands out in that industry.
Yeah, that one definitely stands out. And had it come out after the Matrix movies, I would have said, why didn't they choose Neo and not the Oracle?
That'd be a good one too. I'm sure there's a Neo company somewhere, right?
Yeah, probably in Northeast Ohio. That's a good pick. I like that. And you're starting to see them more and more frequently, the Oracles, that type of name. But it's always good to be the trendsetter.
Yeah, another one like Nike, a name that just has some good meaning with the original word attached to it.
So my last one is Lego. Lego is the abbreviation of two Danish words, legat, meaning play well. And that's the idea behind the company. They said, it is their ideal.
Yeah, that's a good name. And that's one that, you talk about the meaning behind the word just being so attached to the company, it's almost impossible to think about in any other way.
Mm-hmm.
Like you just can't take away from your brain. You see the name Lego and you think of a Lego, and it's impossible to detach that. Even though at the time that came out, if you were alive, you'd be like, what a weird name. That's a good one too. My last one I went with is Xerox. I mean, this is a very unique name. It uses the X, a not often used letter. You don't see that a lot in a lot of words or in general reading. You just don't come across a ton of X's. And I like the way it reflects what the company does with the X's on each end. A copy, right? So the company was originally called Haloid Photographic Company when it started way back in 1906. And that was named for the founder. And then he came up with the term xerography, which comes from two Greek roots and means dry writing, which I guess is what separated their technology from the others. Was everybody else kind of did some form of wet copying where theirs was dry copying. So that kind of evolved then over time to become, it was Haloid Xerox in 58 and then Xerox Corporation in 61. So it eventually just kind of got shortened to Xerox. And like I said, the X on the front and on the end, I mean, it just really makes the name stand out. It's a weird name that shouldn't work, and you know, if I saw this word and didn't know it, would I be able to say it? I don't know. It was so unique that it took root, and I think it does reflect pretty well what the company actually does.
Yeah, well, and what's kind of funny about that company name, it was such a pivotal piece in that technology that it became synonymous with the action.
Became the verb.
Yeah.
Like Google.
Yeah, which is the most amazing things you could have happen to your brand, It's like Kleenex. All tissues are not Kleenex, but people just refer to them all as Kleenex.
Yeah, or Band-Aid. If you become the generic term or you become the verb, either way, you've gone to the next level.
Yeah.
Definitely a strong name.
Good picks, I think, overall. I like hearing a little bit about the history of those because I've only looked at the ones that I picked, but it's always fun to hear why people name them or why they didn't have reasons for picking that name.
And there were a few like that. Starbucks is one that's kind of stuck out into my mind, that there was just a name for a character in Moby Dick, but there's no real connection to coffee there whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, that's kind of a bummer. I thought it was going to have a much more unique origin story than that.
Well, I was hoping that it had a Battlestar Galactica connection, but it didn't.
That's right. Was there a Starbuck in the original?
Yeah.
Battlestar Galactica?
He was the central protagonist in that. Anyway,
got off course there. So on that note, let's jump into our top takeaways.
So my top takeaway today, Shad, is this. Company branding, like movie branding, it's a curious thing. But brand names should be handled with consideration. So consider why you're naming the brand. Consider who your brand speaks to. Consider the implications of naming the brand Siemens. We're talking about Siemens, the power generation, power transmission, and medical diagnosis company. And what are those potential outcomes and side effects of naming it? Consider how the name will summarize your brand. So, coming back, full circle, consideration.
I particularly like the Siemens example, which is something I came across in doing some research for this, along with some other names where you're like, how and why? Maybe It was the time, who knows? Which kind of ties into my takeaway here, which is whether in movies or in business, Give yourself a name that puts you in position to succeed at the highest level. Make it simple, powerful, meaningful. Think it through. Put some depth behind it. Give it layers. You want a name that underlines your mission and the key benefit you're trying to offer, that has a story that adds power to your company, so that if someone asks you what it means, you can tell them something better than, "It sounded cool." Perhaps most importantly, make your company name unique. This takes some risk and an adaptation period, but it will give you the biggest payoff. Words like IKEA, Xerox, Nike, Google, and Starbucks didn't mean much until they did. That's because the companies gave them their meaning. They defined them. Choose a name that can be all yours, that you can own, that people will remember you by. Give yourself a name that puts you in position to succeed at the highest level.
That's great. I love that when you say they didn't mean much until they did.
That's right. You're writing the history of this word, right? Or set of words. You're defining this name you're giving it. So that's the key thing to remember.
Yeah, great takeaway all around. And like I said at the very beginning, hindsight is 2020. Just like the history of the Star Wars franchise, the titles of the movies, altogether they sort of coalesce into this very well-rounded naming architecture. But when you see them individually, they may not make the most sense. And there's still going to be weaker ones and stronger ones, but they don't mean much until they do.
Exactly.
I love that.
Like the word Jedi itself. Jedi was nothing until Jedi became something, right?
Exactly.
Good stuff today, from Star Wars to names to business. Come for the Star Wars, stay for the company names. That's what I always say. By always, I mean never. But from now on, I'm going to say it all the time.
Yeah, well, I'm always going to say, that didn't mean much until it did. And that's it for today's episode, everyone. You can find more episodes of the podcast, along with a lot of other great content, at speakinghuman.com.
Email us your thoughts on today's show or any questions or comments. Feedback at speakinghuman.com. That's feedback at speakinghuman.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Speaking Human. Catch you then, humans.
Speaking Human.
Ba